Button now. So thank you for joining us tonight for our talk with Conor Moynihan from the RISD Museum. I'm going to do the briefest of introductions so that Conor can talk about the wonderful Variance exhibition that's on view at RISD right now. But I would like to do just a very brief introduction. Conor Moynihan is the assistant curator of prints, drawings, and photographs at the RISD Museum and is a visual studies PhD candidate at the University at the University of Buffalo, which is a SUNY institution. His dissertation explores how contemporary artists engage with and critique the aesthetics of Orientalism, primitivism, and exoticism with a focus on queer, transnational performance and lens-based artists. If you have not yet seen the Variance exhibition at the RISD Museum, it is really, really wonderful, and I hope that you will take time to go see it. And Conor has a wonderful curatorial background, and he's brought all of that to that show. And so we're really delighted to have him talking about it here tonight for all of us. You will remain muted during Conor's presentation so that we can all hear him. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat at any time, and I'll be happy to ask your questions for you during the Q&A after Conor presents his slides. And then, if there's anything that you don't feel comfortable putting in the chat or you want to ask separately, you can email me the question and I can sort of connect you with Conor, or we can ask it separately if that's preferable to you. So I'd like to thank you all again for being here, and thank you to Conor for taking the time to talk about this excellent show. And then I will ask Conor to unmute, and I will mute myself.
Thank you, Michael, for that lovely introduction and for inviting me to talk about Variance today. And thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be here. I just wanted to say I just got back from a work trip rather late, so apologies if I stumble at the beginning as I just give my bearing. And I'm going to speak for 45 minutes today. That's the plan. I have a lot of slides to show, and I'm not going to get through all of them, but I have them here so that way if it makes a question, I'm happy to address it more at the end. So I'm Conor Moynihan. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. It's so great to meet you all, and I'm going to get started. So today I will be talking about my exhibition, and as Michael mentioned, this is on view currently at the RISD Museum. It is on view through October 9th, so I do hope that you can make it out to see it. It is called Variance, Making, Unmaking, and Remaking Disability. And I'll explain a little bit about the show. So I'm not going to read all of the text that is on the slides. It's just sort of there if you like to read deeper. But this is just a very short statement about the exhibition, which was meant to be a permanent collection exhibition. It's something that I started when I came to the RISD Museum in 2019, and I was given the opportunity to do a permanent collection exhibition. And I really wanted to think about representations of disability and illness that are within the collection. And again, I work with works on paper, so we have over 30,000 works. And when I raised this as a topic to many people, many of them asked if there would be enough work in the collection to support a show like Variance. And the answer was yes, in abundance. There were so many works that we could connect to this topic. But what that question revealed to me is that we're not quite trained to recognize disability or sort of signs of disability when we encounter it, even though we encounter it all the time. And so that really also became sort of a guiding structure to the show, is thinking about what's in the collection and how do we connect these under this really large umbrella term of disability. And just to sort of foreground where I'm coming from when I'm using this term, some of you might be familiar with disability as an experience or identity or a field, and others might be learning about this for the first time today. But I'm following what is known as the social model of disability. And the social model of disability, it was put forward by disability activists in the 1980s. And it's basically this idea that disability is not a defect of the body. It's the fact that certain bodies or certain minds are privileged in built environments or social environments, and therefore have access, whereas others do not. And so the social model really sort of pivots away from the body as defective and in need of cure or repair, and sort of pivots toward this idea that we can reform social norms or the built environment to make things more accessible for more people. And so the classic example of understanding the social model is if we think of a building, if it's very tall and it doesn't have an elevator, it only has stairs, this is accessible to a certain type of people. But if those like that have maybe mobility differences or use a wheelchair, it would be inaccessible. And that's where disability comes into play, right? Where the body sort of is interacting with the environment and producing disability. There's a lot of ways that we can push against that and think about this critically and more nuanced, but just for the sake of today, that's just sort of the basic is the spirit of variance. And the show brings together over 30 works. They range from the 18th century all the way up to contemporary art. And I think it's really important to say is not every work in the show is made by a disabled person. Some are artists who identify as disabled and we bring this into their work. Some have experienced an impairment and that's part of the making. But a lot of them are representations by non-disabled artists making representations of disability. And I wanted to deal with all of these because it's part of this history, this larger social context. And I'll get into that as I go forward today. And I'm not going to discuss the work today on the right, but it's one of the works in the show. It's a work by Thomas Seguros, and it really exemplifies the show in the sense that Tom is very well known for many people in RISD, especially at Providence Art Club. And so many of you probably know is that he was a trained painter. He was a beloved professor at RISD. And in 1992, he developed macular degeneration and lost a lot of his eyesight. And it sort of presented him with a career challenge of how does he continue to make work. And he did, and he made this body of work that you see here called Remembered Landscapes. And that's part of the thesis of the show that I'll be talking about today. So jumping forward, I just want to give a sense of some foundations, some quotes I would just like to keep in mind, things I was thinking about when I was putting the show together. So Rosemary Garland Thompson is very significant in the disability studies world. She's considered as one of the founders of people who brought disabilities to the humanities. And when we were talking about the show, she said disability is everywhere if you know where to look for it. And this is really something that I was thinking as I was making this show and I was going through the collection, right? It's if you know the signs, if you know what to look for, you find it all over. And one thing I hope people take away after leaving the show is being more attuned to signs of disability that are around us all the time, because it's in popular culture prolifically and often in negative ways, which we'll talk about. So something I just want us to be more aware of. But then Tobin Siebers, who's also a disability scholar and an aesthetic scholar, he says that disability enlarges our vision of human variation and difference. And this is a bit of a nod to the title of the show, which is called Variance, Making, Unmaking, and Remaking Disability. And I wanted the show to put disability not in a binary, either you're disabled or you're not disabled, and more on a spectrum, sort of thinking about human variation within a spectrum, a continuum, rather than a single point on either side. And then the last quote, which I'm actually going to deal with more at the end, this was someone who came to the show, someone who identifies as disabled, and really was speaking about how meaningful it was for her to see a show that was centering an experience that she could relate to, and that's part of what the change that we need for our disability communities. Okay, so I'm going to jump forward. For those of you who have been to the exhibition, you might have known, or if you've been to the RISD Museum before, these are in the Works on Paper galleries on the 3rd floor. So there's 2 galleries, and I'm going to speak about those galleries and just sort of how they were structured a bit. So the first gallery, which is one of the entry points, the smaller of the galleries, our photo gallery technically. In this gallery, I really had an organization where I really wanted to think about disability culture and disability history and sort of thinking about these sort of shared pieces that go together. But then in the gallery, we can basically break down the artists with a few exceptions, but to artists who identified as disabled or chronically ill, and they incorporate this in a very imagistic way into their work, or artists like Tom Seguros, who I mentioned, who experienced impairment and it shaped the making of their work, but also artists who are very much a part of the art historical canon, but maybe we haven't thought about their life narratives in this way, and sort of thinking about their art through their life narrative with experiences around illness or disability. And I'm just going to have a few images as I go through that sort of situate you. So now you can see where we were in the gallery. To the right, there is the intro text to the show. And this sort of display that you see right here was a way that I really wanted to focus into the thesis of the show really quickly and sort of reveal the stakes as best I could in a very short way. So I'm going to zoom in and look at all of these. So these are three of the works that you saw. This is the left is a print by Jack Levine. At the center is a print by Goya, and at the end is a photograph of General Tom Thumb and his wife, who's Lavinia Warren. And what you might recognize looking at these is that I wanted to slow down and focus on one type of physical difference. And in this case, I was focusing on people of short stature or little people or people with dwarfism. Because if you look at any encyclopedic art museum, such as the RISD Museum, this is one of the most commonly represented types of physical difference that you'll see, going all the way back to ancient Egypt, all the way up to contemporary art. And this type of representation has meant different things in different contexts. And therefore, I wanted us to sort of like slow down, recognize what we're seeing, and also unpack some of the differences and how that informs the way that the work was made. So let's start with the work on the left, which is actually the most contemporary of the works. It was made in 1964. And what you can maybe make out with this image is that you see a woman, she's very well dressed, but sort of dressed in an 18th or 19th century Venetian fashion. And her train of her gown is being held by her attendant, a little person. And what you see is the little person is sort of looking like bored, perhaps at the vanity of the woman where she's gazing in her mirror. And what's interesting about this print is I don't really know what Levine was doing. This is a very much, again, it was made in 1964, so it's a fictive print, right? It's an imagined scene. He's not representing something based off of reality. But that's something I wanted to hone in on, is that disability pops up, or in this case, little people pop up in art and visual culture all the time, and they often serve a narrative function. Now, Levine was very much a social realist. His work really dealt with the social politics of his day, and I don't know what he was commenting on, but again, we see here, in this case, disability at the service of a narrative, a larger narrative within the work. In that middle print, this is a print by Goya. It's after a painting by Velázquez from the 17th century. And what we have here is a portrait of El Primo. El Primo was a real historical person. He was known as what was known as a court dwarf, which means that he was essentially in a possession of the King of Spain. And court dwarves were quite popular in Europe, especially in Spain. Spain sort of held on to this practice much longer. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is, first, we have this really sort of sensitive portrait of El Primo. He's dressed as a gentleman. He's has all the trappings of a learned man. But there's some things that we see that maybe make a nod to the fact that we're looking at someone of a different status. First, he's seated on the ground. And then you'll notice the size of his book, which is a normatively sized book, but in proportion to him, it makes him look very small, and the book sort of outlandishly large. And this is part of the humor that happens when we see representations of physical disability or physical difference, is this sort of contrast of two things that aren't meant to go together. And if you come to Variance and you see the show, you'll see other examples of this, especially artists who don't identify as disabled or didn't experience disability, and how they bring it into their work. But the reason he's also in the show is that it's a very sort of specific historical moment. And, he was known as a court dwarf, and court dwarfs were popular for, we could say, for at least two reasons. First is they were considered natural fools, which means that they were entertaining strictly on their own embodiment. And you can see that again with that juxtaposition of the size of the book to him. But also they were popular with, like, if you can imagine, the king walks out to his court, he's accompanied by his court dwarf, El Primo, and he just looks taller and more grand and stately by comparison. So again, these very simple contrasts, again, why they were very popular. So therefore it's a fraught history, right? El Primo certainly didn't have full agency, but being affiliated with the court gave him much more access to resources than others. So it's like we have to think about him sort of on a spectrum. And then on the right, this is the one that I really wanted to focus on a bit, and there is another sort of work related to her, which is Lavinia Warren. So Lavinia Warren is the woman that you see. Her husband, General Tom Thumb, who's maybe more famous today than she is. They both were performers at P.T. Barnum. That's where they met, actually. But what's interesting about Lavinia Warren is that she was born to a wealthy family in Massachusetts. She had an early and successful career as a child educator, and she left that of her own volition to become a professional entertainer, eventually working at P.T. Barnum. So this was a woman who has dwarfism, but made a very conscious choice about the way that she wanted to live her life, unlike El Primo. And also what's really interesting about this photograph that you see, this is known as a carte de visite. This is sort of like a collector's photograph, something that could be sold and purchased. And what's interesting about this is, it's General Tom Thumb and wife. It's following on the success of their previous carte de visite, which was their wedding portrait. But what's interesting with this one is they never had a child. So this is very much a staged photograph for the production of something that they can sell and profit off of. So I find Lavinia Warren fascinating because she was active in the 1860s and really very much aware of her representation and in control of it. So what I wanted to start with these at the beginning is really just giving this really wide range dynamic representation of the ways that representations of difference, physical difference, can mean very different things in very different contexts. And so sort of thinking about that, both recognizing what we see when we see it, but also understanding the nuances, the social historical context that sort of precede works like this. So this is this entry of the gallery. You see the Tom Segura's painting that I mentioned at the beginning, and then you can see some of the works that are around it. I didn't organize the show chronologically. I wanted the show to be organized thematically or within works that sort of resonate together. This was very purposeful because when I was first working on this exhibition, I was thinking about going from sort of a chronological order, which would have front-loaded a lot of negative representations, which I'll discuss in a bit, and ending on pride. And then we had COVID as I was working on this, and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and it felt a little heavy to just sort of front-load that pain. And so I wanted to disperse it and sort of work around it. So I'm going to just talk about a few more here before I jump to the next part that I would like to talk about. But this is a work, this is a drawing. It's a drawing in collage on Mylar. And what this reproduction here really does the work no justice. So I do hope that you can go and see it in person. This is a drawing by Peter Winslow Milton. And what you see is this sort of like cascading vignettes of scenes within scenes. It's this sort of magical subtlety as you look at this drawing. And it's all done, except for the collage components, which are based on photography. It's all done in black ink. So there's just this beautiful range of black tonal ink. But there's nothing overt about disability in this work. And a lot of what I was thinking about is not just when we see it in the work, like the works I mentioned, but also how it's part of the making. And being part of the, an art and design school, we have so many art and design students, it was really important for me to have works that really speak to the way that disability adds to the work or sort of was involved in the making of the work. And the reason that this is in the show is Milton, who did a semester with Joseph Albers, the color theorist. And then he finished his MFA, and he had early on in his career, he had a solo show, and the reviews came back and asked sort of questioning of why his trees were so pink. And he was like, why are my trees so pink? I've jumped forward slides here to a quote that he was saying that speaks to this is he realized he was colorblind, so he couldn't see green and red. He couldn't distinguish those. And this was something, again, that he discovered after his, sort of starting his artist career. And he therefore made the very conscious decision to only work in black tonal ranges because he wanted to work within a color palette that he felt confident that others were experiencing the same way that he was. So again, it's not in the work, but it was a way that, someone recognized the way that they see the world differently and made a very conscious choice to make work that responded to that. And another thing with this quote, and if you come to the exhibition, as much as possible, I tried to give my labels over to the words of the artists themselves, really letting them explain their work rather than me putting the curatorial voice on top of them. What was really interesting about this drawing, I had already selected for the show, but like one thing, as I said, remember, I said disability is around us all the time. We just don't always know how to look for it. And this drawing revealed this for me too. You know, I had already selected it for the show on the grounds that I mentioned. And then as I was looking closely, I looked at the lower left corner and there's this little image which I've blown up at the far left. This is pulled from Edward Muybridge. Muybridge was a 19th century photographer who developed a photographic technique to get these instantaneous moments in time, sort of anticipating cinema that would be coming after that. But previously it had been impossible. So we had not seen human motion in sort of these slices of individual time. So he was, because of this technique, he was hired by the University of Pennsylvania, where he documented the movement of people, including people with physical disabilities. And this image that you see is a direct lift from one of his photographs of someone with a physical disability in their movement. I do not know why Milton included it, but again, it was something that as I was looking more closely at it, I encountered it and I recognized it. And so yes, disabilities around us all the time. I'm going to jump forward. The other category of artists in this room would be artists like Edward Munch. So artists who are very much a part of the art historical canon, but maybe we haven't thought about illness or disability in their life narrative. And Munch we actually have. We've talked about mental health differences with Munch, but I wanted to pivot and focus on something else. So this is a lithograph, a two-stone lithograph. It's a portrait of his sister, Johanna Sophie. And his sister, his elder sister, was very much a caregiver for him, and she died when he was a relatively young teenager because of tuberculosis, and it was a really formative loss for him. And as he sort of went onward with his art career, it wasn't until later that he returned to make work about his sister. So this one, in addition to this other paintings that he's done, were all remembered portraits, right? It's done based off a memory of his sister. But what's interesting is that once he started to make these works, these portraits of his sister, it's where we see a transition in his career from being an impressionist style painter to being an expressionist style painter. And what I wanted to highlight then is the way that illness, and even illness in another person, can be really transformative in an artist's career, right? That's sort of that moment, that encounter marks a shift in the way that he produced work. Just for the sake of time, I'm just going to be a little bit more clipped as I go forward. I just want to talk about two more. Two that, one is like this one, Phoebe Boswell, that's sort of between my categories. But what we have here is Boswell has done this self-portrait. So she's looking on her Zoom screen. So like all of us are on Zoom, she's looking at Zoom. She has a digital background behind her. Like I have a blurred background. She had a scene of Mars, and you can see that it's glitched, right? They get sort of like, if you look between her braids, you can see into her studio space. So this is very much a self-portrait that was done over Zoom. And the reason I include it in the show is COVID is a great example of how illnesses and disability are social, right? They're sort of shared experiences. So whether you had COVID or not, or knew someone who had COVID or not, we all sort of had our lives radically changed by this pandemic. You know, a lot of us use Zoom for the first time. So I really wanted to think about that as well, that illness can be really structurally changing and really, so therefore, work like Phoebe Boswell documents that. But what I want to end for this room is really talking about this drawing by Rivera. I do hope that you can come see this in person. For all the work in the show, this is the one true loan, so we'll have to return it to the private collector, Larry Gerber, after the run of the show. And also, this is on 2 layers of Mylar, so this reproduction that you're seeing here doesn't really do justice to the nuance of this work. But Rivera, this is like my final category of artists in the room, which are artists who identify as disabled and bring this in a very imagistic way or into their work. So Riva, she's a portrait artist. She teaches at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, and she has spina bifida, which means that she has a very visible physical disability. And I mention that because she's very open about it, but also as a portrait artist, she's sort of thinking about the stare. So as a disabled woman with a physical disability, she's very conscious of what it feels like to be stared at, and sort of we can think about like the feminist gaze or the male gaze, excuse me, the feminists have discussed, and disability scholars have discussed the stare as sort of like heightened, where we sort of are invited and allowed to stare at people with physical differences and not sort of try to mask our stare, and sort of the feeling of what it's like to be on the other end of that. But then as a portrait artist, she stares at people to do her work. And so she wanted to sort of like think about that power dynamic and reverse it as best as she could. So what she did for this body of work, which are called the risk pictures, is she invited someone to make a portrait with her. They're often from the disability community, though not exclusively. In this case, yes, this is a portrait of Alice Shepherd. Shepherd is a choreographer and dancer based in the UK who uses her chair in her work in really sort of dramatic ways. And so Riva invited her to make a portrait with her. She came to the studio, and Riva really works closely with her subjects to really sort of realize the scene that they want. How do they want to be depicted? What sort of background do they want to be set in? All these types of questions. But what she did is, after 2 hours of working in the studio on the drawing, Riva vacates the studio, and the subject is then expected to do something to the drawing. But they're also, as she said, allowed to do whatever they want in her studio, no questions asked. Like in theory, she's like, they could break things, they could steal things. She's really sort of turning over that power to the subject. And Riva was really excited about working with Alice, because if you can imagine, if you're inviting people in to make a portrait with you and you're not an artist or a visual artist, you might be a little more timid about sort of going in and working on the drawing. And Alice was really confident. So, you know, what we have is Riva did the figurative work of Alice on her chair wheel and the curtains that you see behind. But then if you see these sort of like feet-like doodles that are sort of descending from the upper left, and then the doodles that are throughout the drawing, that was Alice's contribution. And so then after Alice finished it, then Riva sort of picks it up again and finishes the drawing. And what I love about this, what I'd like to say about this when I'm talking about it, is it really, for me, performs a really important aspect of disability culture, which is this like centering of interdependence. A lot of people in the disability community are really critical of this idea of, or this cultural norm, or this cultural ideal of independence, and really sort of stress the benefit and the need of interdependence, of being reliant on other people and sort of being networked together. And this drawing, I think, does this really beautifully, right? Where you have two people coming together and working on the same drawing and have to respond to the marks of the other to sort of realize the final work. So now I'm going to jump forward to the second gallery, which is a larger gallery. And this gallery, I'm moving away, though it's still here, thinking about disability culture and history, and focusing more on some of those negative representations I mentioned. So I want to talk about stigma and negative representations, but I every time I put a work that sort of fit that category for me, I have works that sort of expand from it and open it up to help it see it from a different perspective. So I'll give like one example probably of that with a few works. And those expansions I was calling pivot points or interventions. And then there were thematic clusters like madness and asylums or HIV/AIDS. And then there was also, again, sort of pride in designing for disability. So this is the sort of the portion of the gallery that I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be speaking mostly to that print by Hogarth at the far right of the screen, and then the three lithographs that by Michael Mazur that are between. I'm going to start first with this. So this is the oldest work in the exhibition. This is by William Hogarth. It is from his series, A Rake's Progress, which was a series of paintings, 8 paintings that he then made into etchings and engravings. And this is the final plate in the series. And I really wanted to include this one because I really wanted to think about the negative representations, because I have a very strong belief that we need to confront the negative representations, and if we want to make change from them, we really have to understand what we're dealing with. And the reason why I call this negative, I guess I should unpack that a bit. So this is called A Rake's Progress, which follows Thomas Rakewell. Thomas Rakewell is this gentleman right here seated on the ground. Thomas Rakewell was a real historical person. He was part of the newly minted middle class in England. So his father was a merchant and made his money through that means. And then Tom inherited that money on his father's death. And what he does is he spends it almost immediately on alcohol, gambling, and prostitution. And he ends up, after a series of events, in Bethlehem Hospital in London, an asylum. Which is what you see here. And so what Hogarth is doing is really championing being moderate and sort of being moderate as a social good. So this is very much a moralizing tale of, if you're an excessive person, this is your just results, right? Sort of being institutionalized, which was a carceral system at this point in the 18th century. And so what Hogarth has done, because these are a series of prints, these are meant to be legible, they're meant to be accessible to a wide range of people, is he really did these very exaggerated tropes of madness, including things that were coming from his own mind. So Rakewell, of course, is a real person that he's responding to. But in the back left, you can see this figure sort of looking up fervently at a cross, sort of the religious fanatic. Then in the middle doorway, you have this man sort of wearing a makeshift crown and maybe looking at a mirror or a club, that sort of over-aggrandized person, the self-aggrandized self, all signs of, excessiveness, and therefore for Hogarth of madness. But the show is called Making, Unmaking, and Remaking Disability because our very notions of what constitutes madness or disability are really specific to particular moments in time, and they shift. And so the reason I mention that is, if you look at this figure who's drawing on the wall, why is he here? And some people have guessed, like, oh, maybe he was theorizing the world is round, and that's why he's ending here, which is a really good guess, but that's well established at this point. What this man is doing, and it's hard to read, is it does say longitude. He was trying to solve the longitudinal problem. And the longitudinal problem was that sailors knew how to figure out where they were at sea by latitude, but not longitude. And as you can imagine, in the 18th century, the British Empire was really invested in solving this problem. So there was this huge prize money out there for whoever could solve the problem. However, in Hogarth's day, it was widely believed to be impossible, and only two people would really be trying to do this. Either they were trying to steal your money, or it was a sign of madness, right? Only the insane would ever be trying to do something like this. The irony is that within a few decades of this print being made, the longitudinal problem was solved. But for Hogarth, this was meant to be this really recognizable symbol of madness, right? That his everyday viewer is going to look at this and immediately get it, even though it was solvable, and it was solved. And then the other sort of thing I like to highlight with this print is, if you see those two women, those sort of two well-dressed women over to the right, it's like, what are they doing here? Right, they're not sort of in a carceral system. They seem to be there of their own volition. They're also well appointed. They look to be gossiping, as some people have commented. And what these women are is they're penny gawkers. So it was a relatively popular middle class pastime in 18th century, where you could pay a few pennies on Sunday and you could tour and gawk at people in the asylum. And if you think about that, this is really like a really heavily and loaded, like, cultural phenomenon that was happening. And the reason therefore I'm calling this negative representation, and the reason I wanted to really unpack this and really think about, like, this is not that long ago that this is the way that we were treating people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, perhaps. And one thing to think about too, the reason I wanted to highlight it and comment on it, is there was a study that came out recently discussing implicit bias. So that immediate reaction, do you have a positive or negative association with the type of a group of people? And the period that they've been tracking it for a decade or so, they've seen gains for people of color and LGBTQ individuals of sort of against implicit bias. But during that same time period, people with disabilities have stayed relatively consistent. And I think a lot of this has to come to do with print media and popular culture and visual culture, where the disability is often shorthand for bad, right? That it's something that you don't want. And I really wanted us to think about that critically, and why that's is so deep-seated in our culture, and think about it critically when you see examples of that in contemporary popular culture. So jumping forward, I'm going to focus on these 3 prints in this to the right. These are by Michael Mazur. They're called Images from a Locked Ward. And here you can see them in a little bit more detail. These are also based on an asylum. And I want you to just keep in mind some of the differences between what we saw with Hogarth and what we're seeing now with Mazur. And so Mazur, he taught at RISD in the early 1960s for a brief period of time. And he started to do this body of work. So it's something that he had started actually before when he was doing his MFA, but he was going to asylums or mental health hospitals and volunteering as a art therapist. I don't exactly know what therapy he was providing. People were a little fast and loose with that term, but that was why he was going to these spaces. And in particular, for this body of work, Images from a Locked Ward, he was going to an asylum that was in Cranston, Rhode Island. So it's very specific to where we are. And he was really taken with the condition of the people inside. And if you can imagine, a lot of these people were very much out of sight, out of mind. You know, they were, if you didn't work there or you didn't have people in your family that were being institutionalized, a lot of people didn't know what was happening there. And so what Mazur is doing is really giving this very evocative image, this emotional image of what it feels like to be in those spaces. And if you think about Hogarth, Hogarth is theatricalizing like madness, right? And sort of making this spectacle based on his imagination. And here, Mazur is theatricalizing the experience of confinement. And you can see it as a bit, sorry, my cat just jumped up there. You can see it a bit as the social model of disability, right? Which is, it's really about how bodies sort of intersect with the world. And here we're seeing how people with being institutionalized here are intersecting with their environment, which is being confined and restrained. And what Mazur is trying to do, I feel, is sort of bring out the humanity of these people. Now, there's a lot of room to critique these, of course, because Mazur had the great benefit of being able to enter the asylum and leave the asylum, unlike the people that he was portraying. But at the same time, he was doing a lot of these where he was working and volunteering, and then he would go back home and he in his studio and he would make drawings from that experience. So he's really not trying to traffic in anyone's individual suffering, but really give an image to something that was what most people couldn't see. Therefore, I think they're very significant in that way. And these were done in the 1960s. And it's an important moment because in the 1960s, between the 1960s and the 1980s, we had the rise of the independent living movement happening in the United States and globally, which was really calling for the end of asylum-based care and this move towards community-based care. Something that Rhode Island was a leader. So in 1955, for every 100 people institutionalized in the state of Rhode Island, only 2 people are institutionalized today. Now, I don't want to overstate that. There's been a lot of issues with community-based care because we don't fund it, but it does mark this important shift of treating people with intellectual and developmental disabilities as full people in society. And Mazur is sort of documenting this early moment of that, right? This sort of moment before we were, experiencing that change. And it's something like for that 20-year period, 60s to 80s, it was something like 500,000 Americans were deinstitutionalized from these types of institutions. So I'm going to jump forward now. Well, actually, I just want to talk about this one print. What I really love about this print is what, if you see in the whole body of work, is the architecture of the space. And you have those 2 people sort of peering in, that sort of medicalized gaze. And then what does a person do when they're in utter confinement? And you see this man or this figure sort of torquing his body and sort of moving his arms. It's sort of insistence on agency, right? That sort of insistence on movement in total confinement. And it's really, when you look at it closely, it just sort of evaporates into gestural mark making. And it's that gestural mark making that really gives it its emotional power, I think, right? It's not about an individual. It's about this sort of the confinement within the asylum. Now, as I start to wind down, I do want to make sure that I talk about this work, especially since we're in June, this happy Pride Month to all that are here, and really think about Pride, not just in terms of sexuality, but also in disability Pride. And this one is a work by Robert Andy Coombs that sort of fits both of those categories. This is a really large photograph. It's 40 by 60 inches. I'm going to jump forward. so that you can see. Again, this is another work where the reproduction doesn't do it justice because Coombs prints on metallic paper, so there's this beautiful luminosity. So I do hope you can see it in person if you're in the Providence area. But this is, so what we have here is the self-portrait. So Robert is the white figure on the sofa, and behind him is his collaborator and partner, in this case, Danny. And it comes from Coombs's body of work called Crip Fag. And so what we have already with this work, with that title, this series title, is like 2 words under active reclamation, right? So fag, this derogatory term, one that I feel is still very painful, directed towards LGBTQ individuals. And then crip. Crip might be a word that you're familiar with or not. It's also a word under reclamation. It comes from cripple, and people in the disability community have used it to sort of, sometimes the way I like to describe it is like disability identity plus politics is sort of how people sometimes understand crip identity. But again, taking a negative word, 2 negative words, and trying to reuse them for different means. But they also speak to this, the importance of this work. So, Coombs is someone who, while he was a relatively young man, when he was in his undergrad years studying photography, he suffered a spinal cord injury and developed paraplegia. And as he said, as we were talking, he was going through his recovery from that and sort of like learning the way that he moves in his body and all these sort of changes that had happened. But as a young man, he had really significant questions like, can I have sex again? Can I have gay sex again? And as he said, like no one was really prepared to answer that question for him. So it really became a way to explore his body and sort of explore his sexual identity, and also insist like, yes, I can, and here's how. And this, it's printed at a really large scale, 40 by 60 inches, so just nearly life size. So you really, when you're in front of it, you're really like in his living room. So it's both like his sexual intimacy with Danny, but it's also very domestic. Like you can see his living, his living room. And then he makes all these nods to his disability identity. Of course, he has his G-tube, his straw, other sort of things of his life, but then, he also has his Afghan that is right there. So he has all these nods to his disabled identity and his queer identity, and really sort of normalizing it, but also making it sexy, right? That like the disabled body is a sexy body, and that disabled people want sex just like everyone else wants sex, or, in the same range of that it comes with everyone else. And that's something that's really important because often people with physical disabilities or intellectual disabilities get infantilized, right? That it's, that sex is not for you. And here he's really insisting on his sexual identity. And then the title also speaks to it. And I think this is maybe changing as his work is getting more attention. But he said, especially at the beginning when he was doing this body of work, that he was often framed as too queer for the disability community or too disabled for the queer community. And he's an intersectional, right? He's both of those at the same time. And so really insisting on that together. And what you can't really appreciate in the slide version of this, to the same degree if you don't see it in person, is where the camera is with this photograph. So if you can imagine how the vertical height of the camera would be, it's much lower. You can really see that couch. And what he's doing is he's sort of photographing from the height of his chair, like the height that he would be using from his chair, which I love to think of as like a reworlding from a disabled perspective, right? It's like seeing the world from his perspective. It's this really sort of subtle nod. In addition to all the objects that are in the work, it's also that height that is sort of centering his point of vision as the normative point of view. And then I just want to talk, as I wrap up, just a few things about the show. So in addition to doing a show about disability and representations of illness and disability, I wanted to think about points of access for the show. So there were things that we did differently than we've done for other shows. And part of these that I wanted to do is I wanted everything to be sustainable, so that we could continue to do this for future shows. So it wasn't just that we have a show on disability, we have our accessibility features and then they go away. So things that we worked on, which were sort of happening for around the same time, which is alt text, which is textual descriptions of image files. That's more for if you access the show digitally or through the website, and you need a screen reader or you have low vision and would benefit from having the textual description. We did that for the show, and we're doing that for the rest of the museum. Font choice was really specific. I really wanted a font that would be more dyslexic friendly. Now, there's no one font that is friendly for all people with dyslexia, but I chose a font that gets higher marks for being friendlier, which means it's sans serif. And you can't really see here, but the B's and the D's are slightly different. One has a tail, one does not. So it's not as easy to reverse as many people with dyslexia experience. And then label size. So if you can see on the left is our more traditional label. And I know there's not much sense of scale here to give you a sense. But then for variants, I did a much larger format label. So I believe the text is 18 size font, which is good for large format. And this has been, I would say, one of the biggest successes for people who, whether they identify as disabled or not, have really appreciated this larger, text size. Even for me, as someone who is tall, I'm 6'1", like I don't have to bend down to read the label. I can see it from where I am. And if you're lower, I think you can also see it better as well. So I hope that's something that we can continue. And then the other thing I wanted to say was, the hanging height. So typically we hang our shows at the museum at 60 inches from center, not exclusively, and we hung from 58 inches from center, a little bit lower. And that is, again, no one design is going to benefit everyone, but for most people, it's easier to look down than it is to look up. So if you had to make a choice of being too high or too low, it's better to go a little bit lower. And so 58 is the height of the show. And then I just want to say very briefly in my last few minutes is just some initial responses that I've gotten about the show, which has been so meaningful for me. I worked on the show for 2.5 years, and I was in conversation with my colleagues at the museum and people who are part of the disability community like me in other parts of the world. But when a show opens, it becomes public and you really don't know what is going to happen from there. So this is a post by Farah Garland, who I mentioned at the beginning. She took this wonderful self-portrait and posted it on social media. And what I loved about her post is she first mentions how important a show like this is, which I was so pleased that it resonated with her, but also the ways that we still have a lot of space to go, right? Like the sort of the experience of what it feels like to be the only person using a mobility aid in a gallery in a show about disability and sort of seeing that stare, again, that's what Reba was discussing in that work behind her, but also really insisting that we need systems and culture-wide progress and really believing that art is part of that change. And I hope it is too. So this was just this lovely sort of moment that happened with the show. And then this was an email I received from a RISD student, really saying that they've never felt that their disabled identity had been portrayed in a meaningful or significant way during their time at the RISD Museum. This is someone who I didn't know who had reached out to me. And so I really appreciated this because this is exactly what I was hoping would take away, that we would have, we could have a better understanding of disability and illness, but also we could center a large part of our community that we haven't centered in the museum before. And if we follow the CDC guidelines, it's roughly 1 in 4 Americans could identify as disabled. It's a huge part of our population, and therefore I really was wanting to center that. And so I'm just going to wrap up with those same quotes I started with, and I hope they sort of rang true, which is disability is everywhere if you know where to look for it, and disability enlarges our vision of human variation and difference. And I'll just say one more thing about that, which is the reason I picked the title Variance. It was from this, but also I wanted people to be able to see their experiences with their body or their mind in this show, and not thinking about too much of like disability or like as a formal category of having to fit into in a legal way. And a lot of people who I've done this show with have asked, like, I'm diabetic, would I fit in this show? And for me, it's like, yes, absolutely. So I just like, we all bring our body and minds with us through the world. It's a very formative way of being in the world. And so I want us to sort of like center that and think about that we all come from these different backgrounds, and that adds value. And then I mentioned Farah Garland. And then the last thing I'll say is, and I'll drop the link in the chat, there is a publication manual, our publication manual 17, which complements and expands on the show. It is available for free digitally, so you can scan the QR code here, or you can get the link when I drop it in a moment. And then the print version will be coming out in the coming weeks, which will be available for purchase. And I hope you consider checking either of them out. thank you so much. So I'm gonna stop talking and maybe move to the Q&A.
Great, that was awesome. Thank you so much, Connor. Connor was nice enough to show me around the show, and I learned more things from listening to this talk. There's so much to learn about this show and so much to see in it. So I do hope all of you get a chance to go and see this exhibition in person as well, because like Connor was saying, the labels, that was something I was going to ask about. I'm happy Connor mentioned the labels are really, you can really see the difference in the museum when you're looking at them and then looking at other labels throughout the space. You can get a sense of that and of the way the exhibition is designed, in addition to the work that's been selected for it, is really fascinating and wonderful. So for everyone, I would invite you to put your questions in the chat. If you have any, I'm happy to ask them on your behalf so that everyone can hear them. And then I can ask some questions of my own, while if people don't have questions of their own or ones you don't feel comfortable asking. Wes said, great job. Thank you for sharing your insight. Thank you, Wes. It's nice.
Thanks, Wes.
Any other questions that people want to put in the chat? That'd be fine. One question that I had in terms of sort of technical kind of museum question is, you've worked on similar topics in other previous exhibitions. Do you see this as an area of curatorial work that is beginning to grow, that's beginning to become more of interest to different institutions? And if so, what other shows might be going on either now or shows that people might look back on to learn more about this topic?
That's a really great question. I'm so glad that you asked it. I do think this is becoming of greater interest. You know, I started working on this topic in 2016. That was when I was supposed to have a show that was going to explore illness and sort of the relationship between illness and art. And illness was really my entry point for entering the disability community, thinking about chronic and acute illnesses and sort of, so I've been starting to do that work since then. And I've seen other shows, especially I would say a big theme that I'm seeing a lot is on care and care work, which is really connected to a lot of the themes that I see artists, contemporary disabled artists exploring in their work. But I will just make two plugs. I think it's closed now, but at the MMK in Frankfurt, there was a show called Crip Time, which was exploring temporality through a Crip perspective. The difference between Variance and that show is that was all contemporary work and had this very theoretical lens to it. And mine is much more focused on historical social context. So similar, they overlap. I think more work on both needs to be done. And then there was this beautiful show that I just saw in New York. So I'm so glad I have a chance to make a plug for it at the Leslie Lohman Museum in New York, which is Lorenza Botner, who was a Chilean-German artist. She was a trans woman, disabled. She lost her arms in an accident and was very committed to making work and sort of rejecting prosthetics and sort of intervening on her body. It's an incredibly beautiful show. I hope people can go see it. And then Chella Man at Gallery 1969, he's a queer deaf artist, is doing a show on I'm going to botch the theme, but it's joy, disability and joy. And I think, you know, my show has a lot of heavy moments because I really wanted to think about these sort of more painful things in the history to talk about. But I think centering joy through a disability experience is really important. So that's opening, I think, beginning of next month, beginning of July, in New York as well. So yes, I think there's growing attention to this, and I think there's still a lot to be done.
Yeah. Do you see some of the changes that you mentioned in terms of the sort of labeling and things like that? Do you see that as something that an organization like the RISD Museum would take up like across all of their galleries and try to employ more as they're changing out labels and putting in new things? Do you think that's something that they're going to take on board and try to do?
I hope so. You know, I think it's a slow process to get things going. I think testing them out. So I do hope we do it. I will say alt text, we're like full steam ahead. It's going to be a huge project because we have over 500,000 digital assets that will need alt text for them. As far as label choices, you know, I think each curator has their, you know, will sort of come up with their own label plan. So I think that will take more time to sort of gain traction, but I do hope it does. I mean, that was one thing that really, for me, it was low hanging fruit, and the response to it has been really great. Like not even, you know, a lot of the response to the show it's come from the disability community, which has been really, positive and supportive and really thoughtful. But this is from everyone, like everyone really the label size. So I
Yeah.
do hope we learn from that. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like the labels. I thought they were great. Anne Marie Healy put in the chat, this seems to have some groundbreaking ideas for how exhibitions should be technically organized. Do you think this could be shared with other museums in the USA, like the larger labels, varied hanging height? What have your conversations with other colleagues in other museums been like about this?
I think I don't want to like make it seem like I'm doing something very novel here. This is something I'm learning from other, especially disabled artists and curators who have been doing this work for much longer than I did when I started in 2016. And so I feel like this conversation I'm hearing all around. I just feel like it's sort of in the ether right now, these types of conversations. And I think there's a lot of learning to happen. And there's a lot of groups that are out there that are really great on universal design and can do consulting for that. So yes, I do think this can be shared with other museums, and I've shared my thoughts, and I've also received ideas from other people. So I do feel like there are conversations going on, because one of the challenges with a museum, especially the RISD, actually I was going to say the RISD Museum, but Providence generally, it's not architecturally that accessible, right? There's a lot of issues. And one thing I didn't want to do with the show was like not do a show on disability because things aren't fully accessible, because that seems like contrary to the point. So I
Mhm.
think there's a lot of retrofitting, and I think there's a lot of things that like we might have to do that another museum might not have to, or they might have to do things that we don't have to do. So I think there's going to be some specificity to each location because you're sort of retrofitting access into a lot of these spaces.
Has the theme of disability, have you seen this come up at places like in presentations like the places like the College Art Association or anything like that? Like is it evident in kind of scholarship and that kind of stuff as well?
It is, yeah. So there is. I just presented at AAH, which is the British version of CAA, and I also presented at CAA on a similar topic. So panels exist, scholarship exists, it's out there. I would say a lot of the art historians like myself who are working on disability through art history, I think it's newer, it's smaller. Rosemary Garland Thompson, who brought disability to the humanities, that was in the 90s. So, it's starting to percolate into other fields, but I feel like every year it's increasingly more prevalent at those spaces. And there's a big, Routledge has a big anthology coming out on art history and disability. So yes, I do see a lot of scholarship growing around it.
That's great. That's very reassuring. A sort of artwork specific question I had personally was looking at those lithographs of Cranston by Mazur, and then looking at the other piece that you shared of the other asylum. Hogarth's work was pretty widely distributed from what I understand. Do you know, or do you have an understanding of like how widely distributed Mazur's work was, and who collected that type of work and where it was displayed when it was contemporary at the time?
That's a good question. I don't know if I can answer that off the top of my head, but it was collected pretty, I think, quickly during its time. It was very popular project. I saw it recently at I think it was Yale, and there was a whole write-up about it at Yale about how people were using it to think about empathy and developing empathy through, especially through for med students, sort of like thinking about the medical gaze and the medicalized gaze. So it was widely distributed. It's probably one of his more significant bodies of work. Yes. So and that one that I learned when I came to RISD. So as soon as I started working on this, people had recommendations, and one of the first recommendations was Mazur. So I think people knew that for him, and it was not like other things like sort of lifting things out of storage that hadn't been thought through this way. He was
Mhm.
very much connected to those topics. Yeah.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have any questions you'd like to share in the chat? I don't want to sort of steamroll over everyone if you have questions. Um, my other question would be, was it, I'm sure there are things that I'm sure that you put together an original list and then edited down until you came to the work that you have here. Is there anything that you weren't able to include that you would like to see the museum sort of include in a future show or put on view permanently? Or is there anything like that that people might expect or be aware of?
Yeah, well, I think one thing is I don't want to stop collecting work by disabled artists, contemporary disabled artists. So even though there won't be maybe a specific show in mind, it's something I want to make sure that it's integrated all the time. But then your question was also areas maybe of like gaps in the show. I tried to have a really wide range of representation of different experiences that were within it, but there's still many things that weren't. I would say deafness was pretty absent in the show. Something that I wish, there were some artists I had in mind and maybe to bring into a choir. That like Christine Sun Kim, for example, or Chalaman, that just weren't possible in the time frame for this show. So that was a gap. And then, other things that I would like to see, this is more my interest in the researching of disability, is I would like to expand who gets to fit in that category as well. So one thing I would like to think about as well is like thinking about representations of addiction and other sort of areas I think we could nestle under disability in an important and critical way. So I kind of want to keep it, not in addition to just the work, I also want to keep centering it as a lens, sort of like to like look through art and sort of learn through art through that lens. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. I think it's such an important show, and the work that you're doing as a scholar and as a curator is so important. And I do hope everyone gets a chance to go and see it. If anyone has one last question, or if you don't have a question, I can ask a last question. I think I will ask the last question. Again, I hope you all go see it. Go to the RISD Museum's website to make sure that you're aware of their hours. And the RISD Museum is free on Sundays, correct? Right? I think they're free on Sundays still.
Yes, and it's free on Thursday and Friday after 5. So we're open 5 to
Yeah.
7 on Thursday, Friday. So it's also free during those hours.
Yeah.
And
So there's a
speaking
lot
of
of opportunity.
free, this is the publication in the chat.
Oh,
So
thank you. Yeah. So Connor just put the link to the manual, which is a great publication, in the chat for you all. So be sure to explore that for free online. That's excellent. And go see the show. My final question would be, what is your next project that you're working on? You're working on your PhD dissertation, I'm sure, but is there anything else coming up that viewers will be able to see that you're working on?
yes, Variance was a very big project. Next year, I'm going to do a much smaller exhibition, those same galleries, but less research, and on the performative self-portrait. So it's going to be a photography show. It's going to span, I like to span different time periods. So it'll span, and there won't be a limit on the time, but thinking about photographers turning their camera on themselves and sort of enacting the self. So there definitely will be themes of disability and queerness. Themes I love to include in all shows will be in that show for sure. Yes.
Cool. Sounds like fun. I'm looking forward to that one as well. Awesome.
Thanks.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much to Connor. What a great presentation. It's an excellent show. Really, really good. And I appreciate it. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.